What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. Let me tell you a quick story, ladies and gentlemen. Last weekend, I was getting ready to drop episodes 4 and 5 of Les Mis when, in an attempt to deal with some storage issues on my computer, I accidentally deleted them. And I don't know about you, but anytime I lose a lot of progress on something by, doing an assignment incorrectly, deleting podcast episodes, trying to fight a boss and realizing I didn't save right before the boss, all motivation to do whatever that task was totally disappears. I hope you know that experience so that I'm not the only one who does. Anyways, this weekend, I have a 3-day weekend, and I'm looking out over my very, very snowy backyard, and I'm feeling ready to begin podcasting again. So, let's get back to Les Mis. Chapter 12, The Loneliness of Monsignor Bienvenu. Nearly every bishop has his retinue of young priests, just as an army general has his gaggle of young officers. They are what St. Francis de Sales has called the cubs, les pétrés blancs-bec. Every calling has its aspirants who cling to the skirts of authority. No power is without its votaries, no fortune without its court. Those with an eye to the future flutter round the illustrious present. Every bishop possessing any influence has a bevy of acolytes to run his errands and perform palace duties, eager thereby to win his lordship's regard. To stand well with the bishop is to set a foot on the ladder of promotion. Careers have to be considered, and the priesthood does not disdain sinecures. The church, like other walks of life, has its potentates. These are the fashionable bishops, well-endowed and urbane dignitaries, on excellent terms with the world, who doubtless know how to pray, but also know how to lobby. Men who do not scruple to constitute themselves the antechamber of a diocese, links between the sacristy and diplomacy, abbots rather than priests, and prelates rather than bishops. Happy is he who has their ear. Being men of credit, they can shower fat livings, prebends, archdeaconries, cathedral offices, steps on the road to higher preferment upon the ambitious and the favored, and upon the young who know how to please. In furthering their own interests, they further those of their satellites. It is like a solar system in motion. They shed a glow of purple on their followers, and their prosperity, discreetly shared, is like bread scattered on the water. In the background is Rome. The bishop who becomes an archbishop, the archbishop who becomes a cardinal, may carry others with him. There are secretarial appointments. There is the rota, the conclave, the pallium. From lordship to eminence is but a step, but between eminence and holiness there is only the wisp of smoke from a burnt voting slip. Every tonsure may dream of a crown. The priest is the only man in our time who may legitimately become a king. And what a king, the highest of them all. So there is no greater hothouse of ambition than a seminary. Who shall say how many pink-cheeked choir boys and youthful abbés share the daydreams of the dairymaid Perrette, or how often ambition wears the guise of vocation, perhaps in all good faith? But Monsignor Bienvenu, humble, penurious, and retiring, was not among these potentates, a fact which was manifest in the total absence of young priests around him. In Paris, as we have seen, he had failed to please. No rosy future beckoned to the solitary old man, and no sprouting ambition unwisely sought to blossom in his shadow. His canons and parish vicars were excellent men, somewhat of the people as he was himself, immured as he was in the diocese, with no access to higher preferment, resembling their bishop in all things except one, that they had reached the end of the road and he had achieved completeness. The impossibility of rising under Monsignor Bienvenu was so apparent that the young priests he ordained secured introductions to the Archbishop of A or Au and made off as soon as possible. For we must repeat, a man needs help. A saint addicted to excessive self-abnegation is a dangerous associate. He may infect you with poverty and a stiffening of those joints which are needed for advancement. In a word, with more renunciation than you care for. And so you flee the contagion. Hence the isolation of Monsignor Bienvenu. We live in a squalid society. Success, that is the message, seeping drop by drop down from the overriding corruption. It may be remarked in passing that success is an ugly thing. Men are deceived by its false resemblances to merit. To the crowd, success wears almost the features of true mastery, and the greatest dupe of this counterfeit talent is history. Juvenal and Tacitus alone mistrust it. In these days, an almost official philosophy has come to dwell in the house of success, wear its livery, receive callers in its antechamber. Success in principle and for its own sake. Prosperity presupposes ability. Win a lottery prize and you are a clever man. Winners are adulated. To be born with a call is everything. Luck is what matters. Be fortunate and you will be thought great. With a handful of tremendous exceptions which constitute the glory of a century, the popular esteem is singularly short-sighted. Guilt is as good as gold. No harm in being a chance arrival provided you arrive. The populace is an aged Narcissus which worships itself and applauds the commonplace. The tremendous qualities of a Moses, an Aeschylus, a Dante, a Michelangelo, or a Napoleon are readily ascribed by the multitude to any man in any sphere who has got what he set out to get. The notary who becomes a deputy, the hack playwright who produces a mock Corneille, the eunuch who acquires a harem, the journeyman general who by accident wins the decisive battle of an epic, the profiteer who supplies the army of the Sambre et Meuse with boot soles of cardboard and earns himself an income of 400,000 a year, the huckster who espouses usury and brings her to bed of 7 or 8 millions, the preacher who becomes a bishop by loudly braying, the bailiff of a great estate who so enriches himself that on retirement he is made minister of finance. All this is what men call genius, just as they call a painted face beauty and a richly attired figure majesty. They confound the brilliance of the firmament with the star-shaped footprints of a duck in the mud. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. What he believed. It is not for us to scrutinize the Bishop of Digne in terms of religious orthodoxy. A spirit such as his can inspire only respect. The truth of an upright man must be accepted on his own terms. Moreover, since natures vary, we must agree that all the beauties of human excellence may be fostered by faiths that we do not share. As to the view he took of this or that dogma or mystery, these are secrets only to be revealed when the soul passes naked beyond the tomb. What we may assert with confidence is that for him no problem of faith was ever hypocritically resolved. The diamond is incorruptible. He believed as much as he could. Credo in Patrem was his constant cry, reinforced by the acts of his daily life which satisfied his conscience and assured him that he was true to God. But what we are obliged to note is that, outside his faith and, so to speak, beyond it, the bishop overflowed with love. It was in this, quia multum amavit, that he was held to be weak by the sober-minded, by responsible citizens and sensible people, those cliches of a tawdry world in which egotism takes its time from pedantry. What was this excess of love? It was a serene benevolence, embracing all men and extending even beyond them. He lived disdaining nothing, indulgent to all God's creation. Even the best of men has in him a core of unconsidered callousness, which he reserves for what is animal. The Bishop of Digne lacked this intolerance, which is nevertheless found in many priests. Although he did not go as far as the Brahmins, he had assuredly pondered the verse of Ecclesiastes which runs, "Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth?" Ugliness of aspect and deformities of instinct neither dismayed nor outraged him. He was moved by them, and sometimes grieved, seeming to search beneath the appearances of life for a reason, an explanation, or an excuse. He seemed to be asking God to rearrange things. He contemplated without anger, rather in the manner of a scholar deciphering a palimpsest, the chaos that still exists in nature, and his reflections sometimes drew from him strange utterances, as on one occasion when he was walking in his garden. He thought himself alone, but his sister was a few paces behind him. He stopped suddenly, staring at something on the ground. It was a very large spider, black, hairy, repellent. She heard him say, "The poor creature, it's not its fault." Why not record these almost sublime absurdities of goodness? They were childish indeed, but it was the childishness of St. Francis of Assisi and Marcus Aurelius. He strained a muscle once in avoiding treading on an ant. Thus did he live. Sometimes he fell asleep in the garden, and never did he seem more worthy of veneration. From the reports of Monsignor Bienvenu's youth and early manhood, it would seem that he had been a man of strong passions, even perhaps of violence. His universal compassion was due less to natural instinct than to a profound conviction, a sum of thoughts that in the course of living had filtered through to his heart. For in the nature of a man, as in a rock, there may be channels hollowed by the dropping of water, and these can never be destroyed. In 1815 he was 75 years old, but he looked no more than 60. He was not tall, but inclined to stoutness, and to combat this he walked a great deal, walking with a steady stride and with his back only very slightly bowed, a detail from which we draw no conclusions. Pope Gregory XVI, at the age of 80, bore himself erect and smiling, but this did not prevent him from being a bad pope. Monsignor Bienvenu had what is called a handsome presence, but such was his amiability that his looks were forgotten. The childlike gaiety of his conversation was an especial grace that put all men at their ease. His whole being seemed to radiate happiness. The freshness of his coloring and the unbroken row of white teeth which showed when he laughed lent him that frank and approachable air which causes people to say of a youth, "He's a nice lad," and of the elderly, "He's a sound man." This, it will be recalled, was the impression he had made on Napoleon. It was the impression he made at a glance on any person seeing him for the first time. But to spend a few hours in his company and see him in a reflective mood was to witness the gradual transformation of the sound man into something altogether more imposing. The wide, grave forehead, rendered noble by the white hair, acquired an added nobility from meditation. Majesty emanated from the goodness, while still the goodness shone. To see this was to know something of the emotion one might experience on seeing an angel, smiling, slowly spread his wings while continuing to smile. It was to be imbued with a feeling of respect beyond words, and to feel oneself in the presence of a great spirit, tested and compassionate, whose thought was so all-embracing that it could be nothing else than sweet. The days of his life, as we have seen, were filled with prayer, with the celebration of the offices, the giving of alms, the consoling of the afflicted, the tilling of his garden plot. With brotherliness, frugality, hospitality, renunciation, trust, study, and toil. Filled, indeed, is the correct word, for the bishop's days overflowed with goodness of thought and word and action. But the day was not complete for him if he was prevented by bad weather from spending an hour or two in his garden after the two women had retired to bed. It seemed to be a necessary ritual that he should prepare himself for sleep by meditating under the solemnity of the night sky. Sometimes, if they were awake, they would hear him at a late hour pacing up and down the paths. Peaceful in his solitude, adoring, matching the tranquility of the heavens with the tranquility of his own heartbeat, ravished in the shadows by the visible and invisible splendors of God, he opened his spirit to the thoughts coming from the unknown. At those moments, when he offered up his heart in the hour when the night flowers offer up their scent, himself illumined in the bestarred night and unfolding in ecstasy amid the universal radiation of creation, he could not perhaps have said what took place in his spirit, what went out from him, and what entered in, a mysterious transaction between the infinity of the soul and the infinity of the universe. He pondered on the greatness and the living presence of God, on the mystery of eternity in the future, and, even more strange, eternity in the past, on all the infinity manifest to his eyes and to his senses. And without seeking to comprehend the incomprehensible, he contemplated these things. He did not scrutinize God, but let his eyes be dazzled. He pondered on the sublime conjunction of atoms that gives matter its substance, that reveals forces in discovering them, creates the separate within the whole, proportion within immensity, countless numbers within infinity, and through light gives birth to beauty. This conjunction, this ceaseless joining and disjoining, is life and death. Seated on a wooden bench with his back against a crumbling trellis, he gazed at the stars through the gnarled and stunted outlines of his fruit trees. That quarter-acre of land, with its poor growth and its encumbrance of buildings, was dear to him and sufficient. What more could he need, this old man whose little leisure was divided between daytime gardening and nighttime contemplation? Was not that narrow space, with the sky at ceiling, room enough for the worship of God in the most delicate of his works and in the most sublime? A garden to walk in, an immensity to dream in. What more could he ask? A few flowers at his feet, and above him, the stars. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. What he thought. A last word. Since this account of Monsignor Bienvenu, particularly at the present time, and to use an expression currently in vogue, may have lent the bishop a pantheistic complexion, making it appear, to his discredit or otherwise, that he had evolved one of those personal philosophies peculiar to our century, which sometimes grow in solitary minds and so possess them as to replace accepted religions. We must emphasize that no one who knew Monsignor Bienvenu would have felt justified in supposing anything of the kind. It was the heart that inspired this man, and it was from its light that his wisdom proceeded. No philosophical system, but many works. Abstruse speculation contains an element of vertigo, and there is nothing to suggest that he hazarded his reason in any apotheosis. The prophet may be bold, but a bishop must be cautious. He probably refrained on principle from looking too closely at those problems which are in some sort the reserve of towering and iconoclastic intellectuals. A sacred terror haunts the threshold of enigma. The dark portals are flung wide, but there is a voice which warns the passer-by not to enter. Woe to him who ventures too far. Men of genius from the boundless depths of abstraction and pure speculation, situated, as it were, above dogma, propose their theories to God. Their prayers audaciously invite discussion. Their worship poses questions. That is personal religion, loaded with anxiety and responsibility for those who dare embark upon it. There are no bounds to human thought. At its own risk and peril, it analyzes and explores its own bewilderment. One may almost say that in a kind of transcendent reaction, it bewilders nature. The mysterious world around us gives back what it is given, and probably the contemplators are themselves contemplated. However this may be, there are men, but are they men, who clearly discern beyond the horizon of dreaming the heights of the absolute, who experience the terrible vision of the infinite mountain. Monsignor Bienvenu was not one of these. He was not a man of genius. He would have mistrusted those sublimities whence certain men, and very great men such as Swedenborg and Pascal, have lapsed into madness. Such powerful thinking has its value. It is by these arduous roads that we approach perfection. But he took the shortcut, the Holy Gospel. He did not seek to assume the mantle of Elijah, to shed a light of the future upon the misty turmoil of events, or resolve the prevailing light into a single flame. There was in him nothing of the prophet or the mystic. He was a simple soul who loved, and that was all. That he expanded prayer to make of it a superhuman aspiration, this is probable. But we can no more pray too much than we can love too much. And if to pray outside the accepted text is heresy, then St. Teresa and St. Jerome were also heretics. His heart was given to all suffering and expiation. The world to him was like an immense malady. He sensed fever everywhere, sought out affliction, and without seeking to answer the riddle, did what he could to heal the wound. The awesome spectacle of things as they were enhanced his tenderness. He was concerned only to find for himself and inspire in others the best means of comfort and relief. The theme of all existing things was for that good and rare priest distress in need of consolation. There are men who dig for gold. He dug for compassion. Poverty was his gold mine, and the universality of suffering a reason for the universality of charity. Love one another. To him, everything was contained in those words, his whole doctrine, and he asked for no more. The senator to whom we have referred, the gentleman who thought himself a philosopher, once said to him, "You see what the world is like, every man at war with every other, and victory to the strongest. Your love one another is pure folly." "Well, if it is folly," said Monsignor, without disputing the matter, "then the soul must enclose itself within it like the pearl in the oyster," which is what he did. He enclosed himself in that folly and was wholly content to do so, putting aside the huge questions that fascinate and terrify, the endless vistas of abstraction, the chasms of metaphysics, all those depths which, for the believer, converge in God, and for the atheist in limbo. Destiny, good and evil, the conflict of man with man, the consciousness of men, and the sleepwalking thought of animals, transformation by death, and the recapitulation of lives in the tomb, the mysterious additions made by successive loves to the continuing self, the essence and the substance, the nihil and the ens, the soul, nature, liberty, necessity, problems sheer as precipices, sinister densities beckoning to the giants of the human intellect, abysses which a Lucretius, a Paul, or a Dante explore with blazing eyes, steadfastly turned towards the infinite, which seem to kindle the stars. Monsignor Bienvenu was simply a man who observed these mysteries from outside, not looking too closely, not stirring them with his finger, or letting them oppress his mind, but in a spirit deeply imbued with reverence for the hereafter. End of Book 1. Book 2, The Outcast, Chapter 1. End of a Day's Journey. At the beginning of October 1815, and about an hour before sunset, a man traveling on foot entered the town of Digne. The few people who happened to be at their windows or doorways observed him with a vague misgiving. It would have been hard to find a traveler of more disreputable aspect. He was a man in the prime of life, of medium height, broad-shouldered, robust, who might have been in his late 40s. A cap with a low leather peak half hid his face, which was tanned by sun and weather and glistened with sweat. His coarse yellow shirt, fastened at the neck with a small metal clasp, gaped to reveal a hairy chest. He wore a scarf twisted like a rope, threadbare duck trousers frayed at one knee and in holes at the other, and a tattered gray jacket patched over one elbow with a piece of green cloth sewn on with string. On his back was a new and bulging soldier's knapsack, and he carried a very large knotted stick. His stockingless feet were in hobnailed shoes, and his beard was long. The dust and sweat of his day's journey added a touch of squalor to his down-at-heel appearance. His head was shorn, but stubbly, having evidently not been shaved for some days. No one knew him. Presumably, he was only passing through the town, having come from the south, and possibly from the coast, since he had entered by the road over which Napoleon had traveled 7 months previously on his way from Cannes to Paris. He must have been walking all day, he seemed so tired. He was seen to stop and drink at the public drinking fountain at the far end of the Boulevard Gassendi, on the outskirts of the town. But he was clearly very thirsty, because some children who followed him saw him stop again, 200 yards further on, at the fountain in the marketplace. At the corner of the Rue Poichevert, he turned left towards the town hall, which he entered, emerging from it a quarter of an hour later. A gendarme was seated outside the door on the stone bench from which General Drouot, on the 4th of March, had read to the startled populace Napoleon's famous proclamation upon his landing in Gulf Juan. The stranger respectfully raised his cap. The gendarme did not acknowledge the salute, but looked intently at him, watched him for some moments as he walked away, and then went into the building. There was, at that time, a handsome inn in Digne bearing the sign of the Croix de Colbas. Its proprietor was a certain Jacquin Labarre, a man esteemed in the town because of his connection with another Labarre, proprietor of the Inn of the Troy Dauphine at Grenoble, who had served in the Guides. There had been many rumors concerning the Troy Dauphine at the time of the Emperor's landing. It was said that General Bertrand had paid the inn a number of surreptitious visits in the previous January, disguised as a carter, and had bestowed medals on soldiers and fistfuls of coin on certain citizens. The truth is that Napoleon, arriving at Grenoble, had politely refused the mayor's offer of accommodation at the prefecture, saying that he was going to stop with a personal acquaintance, and had gone to the Troy Dauphine. The reflected glory of the Troy Dauphine, Labarre, extended over 25 leagues to the Labarre of the Croix de Colbas, who was referred to in the town as the cousin of the one in Grenoble. The stranger made for this inn, the best in the district, and entered by way of the kitchen, which opened directly on to the street. All the cook stoves were lighted, and a fire burned brightly in the hearth. The innkeeper, who was also the cook, was busy among his pots and pans preparing a meal for a party of wagoners who could be heard loudly talking and laughing in the next room. As every traveler knows, no one fares better than the wagoner. A plump marmot, flanked by partridges and grouse, was turning on a long spit in front of the fire, and 2 large carp from the Lac du Lazet and a trout from the Lac d'Alloz were cooking on the stove. Hearing the door open, the innkeeper said, without looking up, "What can I do for monsieur?" "A meal and a bed," said the stranger. "By all means." But at this moment the innkeeper turned his head. After glancing at the visitor, he added, "Provided you can pay for it." "I have money," said the stranger, producing a shabby leather purse from his jacket pocket. "In that case, you're welcome." The man returned the purse to his pocket, dropped his knapsack on the floor by the door, and, keeping hold of his stick, seated himself on a low stool by the fire. Digne is high in the hills, and its October evenings are chilly. The innkeeper, still busy with his cooking, was none the less examining him. "Will dinner soon be ready?" the man asked. "Quite soon." While the stranger warmed himself, seated with his back turned to the room, the worthy innkeeper, Jacquin Labarre, got a pencil out of his pocket and tore a strip off a newspaper lying on a table by the window. He scribbled a line or two, folded the strip, and handed it to a youngster who appeared to serve him as scullery boy and personal attendant. He murmured a few words, and the boy ran off in the direction of the town hall. The stranger had seen nothing of this. He asked for the second time, "Will dinner soon be ready?" "Quite soon." The boy returned with the scrap of paper, and the innkeeper unfolded it with the promptness of someone who has been anxious for a reply. He read the message with care, then nodded his head and stood for a moment reflecting. Finally, he went over to the stranger, who appeared to be plunged in unhappy thought. "I'm sorry, monsieur, I can't have you here." The man swung round, half rising to his feet. "Why, are you afraid I shan't pay? Do you want me to pay in advance? I tell you, I've got the money." "It isn't that." "Well, then?" "You have the money, but—"
"But what?"
"But I haven't a room free." The stranger said calmly, "Then put me in the stable." "I can't do that."
"Why not?"
"The horses take up all the room."
"Well, then, a corner of the hayloft, a truss of straw. We can see to that after dinner."
"I can't offer you dinner." The words, spoken in a firm, deliberate tone, seemed to shake the stranger.
"But I'm dropping with hunger. I've been walking since daybreak. I've covered 12 leagues. I must have something to eat."
"I've nothing to spare," said the innkeeper.
The stranger uttered a short laugh and pointed to the spit in the stove. "What's all that?"
"It's all reserved."
"By whom?"
"By the wagoners."
"How many are there?"
12.
"There's enough there for 20.
It's what they ordered, and they paid in advance."
The stranger sat down again and said without raising his voice, "I'm at an inn, and I'm hungry. I'm stopping here."
The innkeeper then bent over him and said in a tone which caused him to start, "Get out." The stranger, at the moment, was bent forward in the act of thrusting a few cinders back into the fire with the metal ferrule of his stick. He swung round sharply, but as he opened his mouth to reply, the innkeeper, looking hard at him,
went on in a low voice. "That's enough talk. Do you want me to tell you who you are? Your name is Jean Valjean. And now do you want me to tell you what you are? I had my suspicions when you came in. I sent a note to the mairie, and this is the reply. Can you read?" He held out the scrap of paper, and after the stranger had looked at it, he went on. "I like to treat everyone politely. Kindly go away." The man rose, took up his knapsack, and left. He walked off seemingly at random along the main street, keeping close to the house fronts, his attitude one of dejected humiliation. He did not once look round. Had he done so, he would have seen the proprietor of the Croix de Colbas standing in his doorway, surrounded by a party of customers and passers-by, talking volubly and pointing towards him. And from the excited and hostile looks cast in his direction, he would have realized that before long his arrival would be known throughout the town. He saw nothing of this. A man crushed by misfortune does not look back, knowing only too well that ill chance follows behind. He continued to walk blindly along streets unknown to him, for a time forgetful of his fatigue, such is the effect of despair. But he was suddenly conscious of an acute pang of hunger. It was growing dark. He looked about him, seeking some shelter for the night. The better establishment was closed to him. What he sought now was the poorest of taverns, the humblest of lodgings for the poor. And as it happened, a light shone at the end of the street. A torch of pine twigs, hanging from a metal bracket, was visible against the pallor of the evening sky. He went towards it. The place was the tavern at the end of the Rue de Chaffaut. The stranger paused for a moment at the window to peer inside at a low-ceilinged room lighted by a small table lamp in the glow of a large fire. Some men were drinking while the host warmed himself at the fire, over which a stew-pot bubbled, hanging from a pot-hook. There are two entrances to this tavern, which is also a species of hostelry, one giving onto the street, and the other onto a small yard with a midden. The stranger did not venture to use the front entrance. He went into the yard, hesitated again, then diffidently raised the latch and pushed open the door. "Who's that?" asked the innkeeper. "Someone looking for a meal and a bed." "Then come in. We can give you both." He entered, and the heads turned to gaze at him as he stood between the light of the lamp and the light of the fire. They watched in silence while he unloosed his knapsack. "There's a stew cooking," the innkeeper said. "Come and warm yourself, friend." The man sat down by the hearth, stretching out his tired feet to the blaze. A pleasant smell rose from the stew-pot. What could be seen of his face under the low-peaked cap conveyed a vague impression of well-being mingled with that other poignant aspect which comes of habitual suffering. In other respects, it was a strong face, vigorous and melancholy, and it contained a strange contradiction, appearing at first sight humble, but then seeming masterful. The eyes under heavy brows shone like a fire under a thicket. But one of the company was a fish merchant, who, on his way to the tavern, had put his horse in Labarre's stable. As chance would have it, he had met this ill-favored stranger that morning on the road between Bras-Dias and some other village, of which I forget the name. The man, who already seemed tired, had asked to be allowed to get up behind him, a request which the fishmonger had answered by digging his spurs into his horse. The fishmonger was one of the group which half an hour previously had clustered around Joachim Labarre, and he had there told the story of this encounter. He now made a covert sign to the innkeeper, who went over to him. They exchanged a few words in an undertone, while the stranger sat lost in thought. Returning to his fireside, the host tapped the man on the shoulder and said, "You must clear out of here." The stranger looked up and said gently, "So you know?" "Yes." "They turned me out of the other inn." "You're being turned out of this one." "But where am I to go?" "Somewhere else." The man picked up his stick and knapsack and left. Some boys who had followed him from the Croix de Colbas and had evidently been waiting for him to emerge flung stones at him as he did so. He swung round angrily brandishing his stick, and they scattered like a flock of birds. He came to the prison. A bell chain hung by the doorway, and he pulled it. A panel in the door slid back. "Monsieur," said the man, removing his cap, "will you be so kind as to let me in and give me lodging for the night?" "This is a prison, not an inn. said the voice of the doorkeeper. "If you want to be let in, you must get yourself arrested." The panel closed. The stranger moved on into a narrow street where there were a great many gardens, some enclosed only by hedges, to give it a cheerful appearance. Among the gardens and hedges was a small, one-storied house with a lit window. Peering through this window, as he had done at the tavern, he saw a large, whitewashed room containing a bed draped with printed calico, a cradle standing in a corner, a few wooden chairs, and a double-barreled shotgun hanging on the wall. A table was laid in the middle of the room, and the light from a brass lamp fell upon a cloth of coarse white linen, a pewter jug shining like silver and filled with wine, and a steaming earthenware tureen. A man of about 40 with an open, amiable face was seated at the table, dancing a small child on his knee, while near to him sat a young woman suckling an infant. Father and child were laughing, while the mother smiled. The stranger stayed for a moment, thoughtfully contemplating this pleasant scene. Only he could have said what he was thinking. He may well have reflected that so happy a household might also be hospitable, and that where there was so much gaiety, there might also be a little charity. He tapped very gently on the window pane, but was not heard. He tapped a second time, and heard the wife say to her husband, "I think there's someone knocking." "It's nothing," said the man. He tapped a third time, and now the husband rose, picked up the lamp, and opened the door. He was a tall man, part peasant, part craftsman, wearing a large leather apron attached over his left shoulder, in the bulge of which were a hammer, an old handkerchief, a powder horn, and a variety of other objects, held in place by his belt, so that it constituted a loose pocket. He carried his head high, and his open shirt front disclosed a powerful, untanned neck. He had thick eyebrows, bushy black side whiskers, prominent eyes, and, above all, that air of being in his own place, which cannot be described in words. "Forgive me, monsieur," said the stranger. "If I pay you, will you give me a plate of soup and allow me to sleep in the shed in your garden? Will you do this, monsieur, if I pay?" "Who are you?" asked the master of the house. "I have come from Puy-Masson. I've been walking all day. Can you do this for me, if I pay?" "I wouldn't refuse shelter to any decent man who can pay, but why don't you go to an inn?" "There are no rooms." "What? But this isn't market day. Have you tried Le Bar?" "Yes, I went there." "Well?" The stranger said, awkwardly, "I don't know. He wouldn't have me." "What about the other place, the Rue de Chauffour?" The stranger's embarrassment increased. He muttered, "He wouldn't take me in either." A look of mistrust appeared on the peasant face. The man's gaze traveled slowly over the stranger, and suddenly he exclaimed with a sort of shudder, "Are you the man—" After a final glance, he stepped rapidly backward, set the lamp on the table, and took his gun down from the wall. At the words, "Are you the man?" the woman had gathered the two children into her arms and now stood behind her husband, her bosom uncovered, staring with horrified eyes at the stranger while she murmured in the patois of the hill country, "Somarad, brigand." All this happened in less time than it takes to tell. After examining the stranger for a moment as though he were some kind of wild beast, the master of the house returned to the door, gun in hand, and said, "Clear out." "I beseech you," said the stranger. "A glass of water." "A bullet's what you'll get," said the man. He slammed the door, and sounds of the shooting of bolts, the closing of shutters, and the clang of an iron bar falling into its slot could be heard from outside. Night was closing in, and the cold alpine wind was blowing. By the last gleam of daylight the stranger saw, in one of the gardens flanking the lane, a sort of hut which looked as though it had been made of turf. Clambering resolutely over a low wooden fence, he went to examine it. It had a very low, narrow doorway, and seemed to be one of those temporary shelters which road workers put up. This was what he assumed it to be. He was cold and famished. Hunger he was resigned to, but here at least was some protection against the cold. Places of this sort were not generally occupied at night. Lying flat on his stomach, he wriggled inside. It was warm, and there was a bedding of straw. For a moment he lay motionless, too exhausted to move. Then, finding his knapsack uncomfortable, and since in any case it would serve him as a pillow, he began to unbuckle its straps. At this moment, he heard a fierce sound of growling, and looking up, saw the head of a large bull mastiff outlined against the faint light beyond the entrance. The hut was a dog kennel. The man was himself vigorous and formidable. Grasping his stick and using the knapsack as a shield, he fought his way out, not without further damage to his tattered clothes. He beat a retreat with his stick outthrust in the defensive posture known to fencers as la rose coivette. When at length, and not without difficulty, he had got back over the fence and found himself again in the lane, alone and shelterless, driven out of a dog kennel, he sank rather than seated himself on a stone by the roadside, and it seems that a passerby heard him cry aloud, "I'm not even a dog!" Presently he got up and walked on, leaving the town behind, hoping to find a tree or hayrick which would serve him for the night. He walked for some time with his head bowed, but eventually, when he felt himself to be remote from all human habitation, he paused to look about him. He was in a field, and before him was a hillock covered with the stubble of the recent harvest, so that it looked like a shaven head. The horizon was very dark, not only with the darkness of night, but also with low cloud, which seemed to emanate from the hillock itself and, rising, to fill the sky. At the same time, since the moon was not yet risen and there was still a last faint glimmer of twilight, the clouds formed a pallid vault, reflecting this light back to earth. The earth was thus more brightly illumined than the heavens, producing a strangely sinister effect, and the sparse outline of the hillock loomed mistily and bleakly against the shadowed horizon. The whole scene was ugly, mean, desolate, and drab. There was no object in the field or on the hillock except a single misshapen tree rustling its branches a few yards from where the outcast stood. Clearly he was a man largely lacking in those finer sensibilities which caused the spirit to respond to the mysteries of nature. Nevertheless, that prospect of sky and plain, the hillock and the tree, was so profoundly desolate that after standing a few moments in motionless contemplation, he turned abruptly away. There are times when nature seems hostile. He went back to Digne, of which the gates were now shut. In 1815, Digne was still enclosed by the walls and square towers which had sustained sieges during the wars of religion, although these have since been demolished. Passing through a breach in the ramparts, he re-entered the town. The time was about 8. Being unfamiliar with the streets, he resumed his haphazard wanderings, passing by the prefecture and the seminary. As he crossed the cathedral square, he shook his fist at the church. There is a printing works at one corner of the square. It was here that the proclamations of the emperor and the imperial guard to the army, brought from Elba and dictated by Napoleon himself, were first printed. Exhausted, and with no further hope, the outcast stretched himself on a stone bench by the doorway of this establishment. An elderly lady who came out of the cathedral at this moment saw him lying there and asked, "What are you doing?" He answered roughly and angrily, "My good woman, you can see what I'm doing. I'm sleeping here." The good woman, who indeed merited the designation, was the Marquise. "On this bench?" she asked. "I've slept for 19 years on a wooden mattress," the man said. "Now it's stone." "Were you a soldier?" "Yes, soldier." "Why don't you go to an inn?" "Because I haven't any money." "Alas," said Madame, "I have only 4 sous in my purse." "That's better than nothing." The man took the 4 sous, and the Madame said, "It's not enough to pay for lodging at an inn, but have you tried everything? You can't possibly spend the night here. You must be cold and hungry. Someone would surely take you in out of charity." "I've knocked at every door." "You really mean—" "I've been turned away everywhere." The lady touched his arm and pointed across the square to a small house beside the bishop's palace. "Have you really knocked at every door?" "Yes." "Have you knocked at that one?" "No." "Then do." End of chapter 1.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That, with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT.
Supporters get a shout out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.